It is now my pleasure to be able to introduce Michael Daniel. Mr. Daniel is the Cybersecurity Coordinator for the White House. Over the years, he has also been very, actually incredibly generous with his time. Here at Georgetown, he has spoken as a keynote speaker at this conference for a number of years. So I want to thank him for that. At the White House, Mr. Daniel leads the interagency development of national cybersecurity strategy and policy, and he oversees the federal agencies' implementation of those policies. Some might think and say that this is a very challenging task and job, and I'm sure it is. He ensures that the federal government is effectively partnering with the private sector, non-governmental organizations, other branches and levels of the government, and other nations. Prior to coming to the National Security Staff, Michael served for 17 years with the Office of Management and Budget. He played a key role in shaping intelligence budgets, improving the management of the intelligence community, and resolving major intelligence community policy issues, including cybersecurity, counterterrorism, spending, and information sharing and safeguarding. With that, I'd like to welcome Michael to the stage.
Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back once again at the International Conference on Cyber Engagement. I'd also like to thank Dr. Anthony Aaron and Georgetown University for holding this conference and their continued effort to foster dialogue about the critical cybersecurity issues we face in the international community. So the President has often said that cyber threats pose one of the gravest economic and security challenges we face as a nation. A view that he recently reiterated in both the 2015 State of the Union and at the Cybersecurity Summit in Palo Alto. And that's true, but this threat is not static. As most of you know, as most of you in this room know all too well, it's growing. The cybersecurity threat is steadily becoming broader as we build out the Internet of Things, more sophisticated as the bad guys learn to industrialize hacking activities, more dangerous as malicious actors become willing to be destructive in their activities, and more frequent as nation-states integrate cyber into their tools of statecraft. As a result, the international community, in my view, is at a strategic inflection point. For over 40 years, cyberspace and the internet has been a strategic asset for the United States and our allies. And we have used it to drive enormous economic and social benefits, despite the prevalence of cat videos on the internet. But now, if we don't solve some of our most vexing cybersecurity challenges, we risk cyberspace becoming a strategic liability for a nation that is as digitally dependent and as networked as the United States is. And that's a future we do not want. So as an administration, we take this threat very seriously. And we've demonstrated through our track record over the course of this administration, but particularly over the last 14 months, as we've released the cybersecurity framework of standards and best practices. We've issued guidance clarifying that sharing of cyber threat indicators are not violation of antitrust laws. We issued an executive order promoting consumer protection in the online payment system. We signed cybersecurity legislation that Congress passed last December that focused on fixing some key internal U.S. government organizational issues. We responded to the attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment. We updated the administration's cybersecurity legislative proposals for information sharing and data breach. We hosted the White House Cybersecurity Summit and consumer protection, where we issued an executive order on information sharing and secured commitments from the attending companies to take action to improve cybersecurity. The President's directed the establishment of the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, and we've issued an executive order enabling the sanctioning of malicious cyber actors. So we've been busy. By Washington standards, believe it or not, this actually counts as innovation. It's not like innovation in the private sector, but it is truly innovation on the government scale. But of course, even with all of that we've done, there's still a lot more left to do. So to successfully address this cyber threat, we must focus on achieving three key strategic goals. We have to raise our cyber defenses across not only this country, but our allies as well, in both the short and the long term. We have to build the capability to disrupt and interrupt what the malicious actors are doing in cyberspace, and we have to enhance our ability to respond to and recover from cyber threats more effectively. So to achieve these goals, the administration has 6 priorities that we're pursuing. We're working to protect our critical infrastructure. We're working to better secure our own networks inside the federal government. We're developing our counter-cyber capabilities. We're enhancing our ability to respond effectively to cyber incidents. We're engaging with our partners and allies internationally. And then we're taking steps to shape the future cyber environment. So on protecting critical infrastructure, the administration has been working hard to raise that level of cybersecurity in those areas. And while the protection of that critical infrastructure remains a responsibility of those owners and operators, the federal government brings a lot to the table there. And we've been working to deepen our collaboration with the private sector so that we can effectively protect our critical infrastructure. We're also working to secure our own networks. We will hold departments and agencies more accountable for improving their cybersecurity. And we've established cybersecurity as one of the administration's cross-agency priority goals for the agencies. And we're also working to develop tools and capabilities to enable agencies to do this mission more effectively and in a more cost-effective manner. But we also have to develop a broad set of tools. And so that's why we're developing our ability to counter and disrupt and interrupt what the malicious actors are doing in cyberspace. And we need those tools from diplomacy to law enforcement to economic to military and intelligence capabilities to do this effectively. Now, these are not necessarily all going to be cyber tools themselves. A good example is the cyber sanctions executive order we recently put in place, where we're using economic capabilities to combat the cyber threat. So we need the broadest array possible of tools to counter what our adversaries are doing. And this will not always involve responding cyber on cyber. We will have to, on a case-by-case basis, determine what the best way to carry out our activities are. But since we know that no matter how good we get at raising our defenses and developing our ability to disrupt what the bad guys are doing, sometimes they're going to succeed. So that also means that we need to enhance our ability to respond to cyber incidents. And we must continue to be able to detect them, characterize them more effectively, share information about them, and rapidly respond. To this end, we've taken several steps inside the federal government to organize ourselves better, including reinvigorating the Cybersecurity Response Group, establishing the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. But we're also taking steps to improve our coordination and collaboration with the private sector so that they understand what capabilities the federal government can bring to the table, and we understand better how they are organized to defend themselves and respond to cyber incidents. As I mentioned, of course, we also have to be able to engage internationally. An open, transparent, secure, and stable cyberspace is inherently linked to the success of the global economy. And therefore, we are going to take steps to protect that global interoperable internet and the ability of all relevant stakeholders to have a role in how the internet operates. We're also working closely to develop the capabilities with our allies to carry out those interruption and incident response capabilities that I mentioned earlier. It's almost become a truism that cybersecurity is a team sport and no one country can do it on its own. And then, of course, lastly, we are taking steps to shape the future of cyberspace to make it inherently more secure. We have to devise ways to make our networks more resilient in the face of cyber threats, and we have to do things like kill off the password, or as I like to say, kill the password dead as a primary security measure. We're going to prioritize research and development and technology that will enable us to achieve those goals, particularly as we roll out the Internet of Things. And we work to bake security much more deeply into those structures. So this holistic, multifaceted approach is critical towards addressing this very complicated problem. But since this is an international conference, I thought that I would dive a bit more into our international priorities and how critical partnerships are to our collective cybersecurity. As I mentioned earlier, we are at a strategic inflection point. And if we look at this inflection point through an international lens, I think where the world is now with this, in respect to this, with respect to cybersecurity, most closely resembles where the world was at the end of World War II. At that time, we were embarking on a multiple years-long effort to build the architectures of global cooperation and coexistence. We didn't know at that point, in the period between 1945 and 1949, exactly how the Cold War was going to shape out, and it could have actually gone in multiple directions. And it was during that time period that we actually built the institutions that served us very well for the next 40 or 50 years during the Cold War. Similarly, I think now we don't quite know how the international environment is going to shape out. We don't know how states will fully integrate cyber capabilities into their toolkit for pursuing their ends. We know that they will, we just don't know exactly what form it will take. As a result, these are uncertain times in cybersecurity, but the threats are growing. But the best path forward is similar to the one we pursued after World War II, doing it in partnership with our allies and building strong international connections and building strong international agreement on how to proceed. Just as we've worked to build partnerships with the private sector and foster internal integration within the United States government, enhancing cooperation with our allies is critical. In this information age, there isn't any such thing as a purely domestic cyber issue. In fact, in my talk last week at RSA, I did it jointly with my counterpart from the United Kingdom to drive home the point that there is no issue that I touch on in my job that is purely domestic, and there's none that's actually purely international. They're always a mix of both. And the issues that the US and our allies face cross all international boundaries and often require cooperation across those boundaries in order to solve. So some of the key areas where we're working government-to-government cooperation I'll highlight now. And we're working to make cybersecurity more effective, not only for our own country, but for the broader global cyber community. All of these are works in progress. None of them are done. And some of them will figure out there are better ways to do it over the next couple of years. But I think you'll see us continue to press forward in each of these areas. First, going back to our first priority that I mentioned, which is related to critical infrastructure. We've been working very hard to globalize effective cybersecurity standards and practices. This past February, when we marked the one-year anniversary of the release of the Cyber Framework, I've been incredibly encouraged by the feedback we've received from industry here in the United States, but also industry from around the world and from our international partners who've talked about developing similar models. Now, of course, the framework is not exactly a scientific breakthrough in cybersecurity. But what it does do is it provides a structured way for companies or cities, states, and countries to think about their cybersecurity risk and decide what they would like their level of risk to be and then how to start going about getting there. The framework points them to the standards and practices that, if implemented, will get you to your desired cybersecurity level. The framework is not a static product. And it will change over time, particularly as we learn to globalize it and integrate more perspectives from around the world. So just as we did when we were drafting the framework, we encourage feedback from companies, industry sectors, and our international partners to make the framework even stronger. Second, we are working to integrate cybersecurity as a core element of our foreign policy relationships with other countries. Since cybersecurity is a shared responsibility, it can no longer be reasonably viewed as an exclusively domestic issue. To this end, we continue to engage our allies and partners worldwide to solidify norms of cyber behavior, what states and other actors should do and what they should not do in cyberspace, and to ensure that the internet remains open, interoperable, secure, reliable, and stable. In doing so, we are striving to create an environment in which everyone can benefit from cyberspace, in which cooperation is encouraged, in which there is little incentive for states to disrupt or attack one another. Collectively, the United States and our international partners are working to establish the frameworks that will guide state behavior in the coming decades. We are promoting norms of behavior for states in cyberspace that respect fundamental freedoms of expression and association, respect for international property rights, build trust and reduce the risk of miscalculation and escalation, and protect individuals from arbitrary or unlawful interference with their privacy online. This is a key element of our foreign policy in cybersecurity. We believe that wide affirmation among states on common norms would contribute to international stability in cyberspace. I know this is an important element of the discussions at this conference and hope those discussions will help us make some progress in this area. So, of course, while norms are very needed, as I said, they're a key component of our efforts in here, not everyone will always adhere to those norms. So therefore, we will also need to pursue deterrence in the international environment. Now, while cyber deterrence is manifestly different than nuclear deterrence, because cyber is becoming a tool of statecraft, deterrence does play a role in our international engagement efforts. Our government is using every tool at our disposal, including diplomacy, law enforcement, cooperation, and other efforts with the private sector to strengthen our defenses and prevent, respond to, and recover from attack. But we must have the capabilities to respond proportionally if and when directed by the President. And in some cases, those responses may involve actions in cyberspace. The Department of Defense's new cyber strategy, which highlights strategic goals of building DoD's cyber forces, defending DoD's networks, being prepared to defend the nation from cyber attacks, building viable cyber response options, and maintaining international partnerships, is just one example of our work in this area. So we also are working to enhance our law enforcement cooperation as well. And I know at this conference in the past, you've heard a lot from folks from Europol and Interpol. And that is a key area that we continue to work to build those international legal frameworks for us to take action to both deter and to arrest cyber criminals that are trying to do their activities through cyberspace. A good example of this is the Game Over Zeus botnet takedown. This effort took 13 governments, 13 private sector companies, 5 U.S. federal agencies, and nearly 2 years to pull off. This is a great example of what we can do when everyone works together. And we need to look at lessons learned from this example so we can do that more often and faster. We are also improving our support to fighting international cyber-based crimes through proactively reforming our own processes for providing digital evidence to other countries. We're taking steps to make this process more efficient, transparent, and responsive for both US-based companies and our foreign government partners. But we're going to do this while preserving appropriate protections for privacy and civil liberties. So I've talked at length about the United States cyber efforts. While I've done this, we are mindful that many countries are still working to develop the industries, technologies, and connectivity necessary for economic development in the 21st century. To bridge that gap, we are committed to connecting more people around the world to the digital future. The United States believes that expanded global access to telecommunications and broadband services, combined with an inclusive, multi-stakeholder-driven internet governance model, remains the best path forward for economic growth that benefits everyone. And across the U.S. government, we have established programs to help governments create cybersecurity policies and programs from the ground up. These programs help address many needs, such as developing rule of law in cyberspace, drafting national cybersecurity strategies, and creating computer emergency response teams. These programs work in tandem with other efforts, such as protecting freedom of expression and press freedoms around the world, to ensure that the internet serves as a catalyst for civic engagement and participation. So while cybersecurity is and will continue to be a difficult problem for all of us, I think the good news here is that we are achieving results through our partnerships. The more we cooperate as governments, the more our citizens and companies benefit. So I believe that we are finally putting ourselves on the right path. And I know that we'll be able to achieve more through our work internationally. I'm actually optimistic that we can work together to ensure that the internet and cyberspace and the interconnected world that we are building will continue to be a strategic asset well into the future. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for a couple of Q&A. If I haven't stunned the audience into,
Yes, Mr. Daniels, Randall Fort with Raytheon. Thank you for being here today. Early in your comments, you talked about the Internet of Things and the need to establish some standards as that continues to unfold. Like so many of these technologies, that will have a certain velocity. We're at billions now, maybe tens of billions in a few years, and I've seen estimates of 1 trillion objects connected by 2030. That suggests that this will be moving at a pretty fast pace. So when you talk about trying to develop standards for security, how do you think government can really play a role given that kind of volume and that kind of pace?
Sure, that's a very good question. I think in my view, when I talk about standards and baking the cybersecurity in many ways that's not necessarily something that government alone or even primarily can drive. Really, it's something that we can foster, it's something that we can encourage, it's something we can promote, but it's fundamentally part of the private sector's role as it drives out those technologies. But a good example in my view is, when we built the internet and a lot of the protocols, we essentially assumed that we would never need to worry about authentication for any transaction on the internet. We never really worried about making sure that whoever on the other end was who they said they were. That just wasn't important to the protocols. But we know now that that's not true. And so as we build the Internet of Things, and as we build out new protocols for communications between devices, and we can build in at much deeper levels of the stack, all the way down to the hardware, much greater levels of requirements for authentication, for example. And that's much easier to do if you do that when the product is being developed than bolting it on after the fact. Now, your point about velocity is quite correct in that in some ways the window for doing this is already starting to close, which is one reason why we're pushing this so hard. But out at RSA last week in San Francisco, the Internet of Things was certainly a big topic of discussion. I'm hoping that we can drive the standards in some of that direction. Other questions?
Colin Clark, Breaking Defense. Cyber Command and the NSA rely on top quality people. If I work for 2 or 3 years, maybe 5 at either one, I'm going to be able to pull in maybe $250,000, $350,000 fairly easily. I'm not going to make that in the government. How, aside from patriotism, are you going to keep those people?
So I think there's actually a couple of ways to look at that question. One of which is that we're not going to keep them. But frankly, that would probably be true even if we weren't facing the incredible pay gaps that we're talking about. Because one of the things that is true across the board in our society is the model of going to work for a company or a government agency when you're 21, straight out of college or out of grad school, and then working there for 30 or 40 years and retiring, that just doesn't happen anymore. So even without the pay gap, we would have to be revising the way that we think about our workforce and allow for a much more fluid movement between the government and the private sector. Second, I would say that everybody faces a shortage of cybersecurity workers. Whether you're talking about the government or private industry. And so one of the efforts that we've had ongoing is to try to expand the pipeline. We've been working through our national initiative for cyber education, through the President's Jobs-Driven Training Initiative, for Scholarship for Service programs, working very hard to try to expand the availability of qualified cybersecurity workers. And then third, sort of linked back to the first point, I think that it's not just about patriotism, but what we do in the government is different than what gets done in the private sector. And some people will just find that that's what they want to do more of. And so the model that I'm hoping that we can move much more towards, as you said, you get somebody, train them for 3 or 5 years, they go out, they spend some time in the private sector, and then decide that they want to come back to the government, and that we allow for a much more, as I said, much more fluid movement in there. And then also recognizing that we're going to need a wide variety of backgrounds to pursue the cybersecurity mission, including smart cyber lawyers and cyber economists and folks with behavioral economics that understand the dynamics of how all of this fits together. So it's going to take a multi-pronged approach to really build out the workforce that not only the government needs, but that the private sector needs as well. Last question? Yep.
My name is Bonnie Bracey, and I'm concerned about education. I know that these people here, I see women from computer science, but we still have a digital divide in knowledge. We have a digital divide, and the school systems think that a program is security. How do we change that? If you think about the iPad thing that happened in LA, what do we do?
So I think your point is very well taken, that I think a couple of things have really struck me. One of, over the last few years, as you really look at the need to bring in, as I was mentioning with that cybersecurity workforce, that also includes a more diverse workforce with a much wider point of view and different perspectives. So both in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of their national origin, both here in the United States and around the world. I think part of it is recognizing that from a cybersecurity perspective, we need to look at the digital capabilities in the same way that we look at reading and writing and basic math skills. They are part of how anybody, no matter what you're doing, whether you're talking about the most basic types of job skills that you have now, it's what you're going to need for any job in the 21st and 22nd centuries. So I think we're going to have to figure out a way to drive that much more deeply into our school curriculums, starting at a very young age, and just treat it as one of those skills that they develop in tandem with other capabilities. Thank you very much, everyone, and letting me come and speak with you this morning. I've really enjoyed it, and I enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you very much.